Hello, listeners. Mallory Wilsey here, Chief Producer of the Enrollify Network. So, everyone is talking about AI these days, but not enough people are taking the time to unpack how AI will impact the future of higher education. And that's why we launched the Generation AI podcast, co hosted by Artis Cadu, CEO of Element 451, and JC Bonilla, Chief Data Officer at VaynerMedia. Artis and JC have worked on large language models for nearly 2 decades and have remarkable technical knowledge around how they work and how generative AI will impact the future of higher ed. Generation AI isn't just about understanding artificial intelligence, it's about being part of the AI revolution in education. Tune in, get informed, and be inspired to innovate in your educational space with the power of artificial intelligence. You can subscribe to the show by visiting podcast.enrollify.org or just search Generation AI wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm a higher ed CMO, and I have a confession to make. I think that the job of being a university president or chancellor is one of the most difficult in the country. The attacks come from all sides, from up, down, side to side. The job is in constant scrutiny, and there are just numerous ways that our country and leaders and people outside of our organizations are trying to tear down our presidents and chancellors. I am so thrilled that my good friend Teresa Valerio Parrot, who is the host of Trusted Voices podcast and the principal of TVP Communications, was willing to come on the show and talk a little bit about her expertise and her advice for those of us who support those leaders. Teresa is called the President Whisperer for a reason. She is absolutely amazing. And this episode almost ends up in a little bit of a therapy session. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO, a podcast that empowers higher ed marketers to bring innovation, creativity, and excellence to their work. I'm your host, Jamie Hunt. Join me every 2 weeks for discussions with some of the best minds in higher education marketing. Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO is part of the Enrollify Network, a robust collection of podcasts designed to help higher educational professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. I am absolutely thrilled to be here with Teresa Valerio Parrot, principal of TVP Communications. Teresa, how are you?
I'm fantastic, and thank you so much for having me. I know we've talked about this, and you've been so patient. I am ecstatic to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. I just think that your voice is so important in higher ed,
Aw.
and I'm so happy to be bringing it to my listeners. Tell us a little bit about your higher ed journey.
I love telling my love story. So
Hmm.
I always joke, and we have this in my bio on our website, that my alma mater was my first love and my husband is my true love, because
Aw.
there's just something special about higher ed. I worked at the University of Colorado, which is my alma mater, after I graduated, and I was in the president's office. And it was such an honor to be able to just be a part of the other side of the experience. And I was there for nearly a decade. My final job was in an officer level position. And while I was in that position, I had my first taste of communications. Up until then, I had really been a policy wonk, and
Oh.
I focused behind the scenes on academic work and governance policies and all of the things of how it gets done, but not how we talk about it. Unfortunately, the University of Colorado had some crises. I reported directly to the governing board, and they decided that if I could make academic policy understandable, I could make tough and crisis communications understandable. So I hired a gentleman named Christopher Simpson to come and help me. And he then founded Simpson Scarborough. And after we had
Wow.
a number of leadership transitions at the University of Colorado, I decided it was time for me to retire. And so I like to say I retired. And on my first day of retirement, Christopher hired me as the inaugural Simpson Scarborough employee.
I had no idea that
Yes.
I had no idea. That's
Yes.
amazing.
So I worked there, and unfortunately, he passed away. And with
Mm.
Elizabeth Scarborough Johnson's blessing, I moved on. And it's almost 12 and a half years since I formed my own agency. And we work exclusively in higher ed, we work on communications. And I could not be happier to still be working on the topics that I love.
Oh, I love that. I love that you described it as a love
It
story. That's
is. Higher
I
education has
if
given me everything,
it gets your hooks in you, right?
right?
Like, it's an industry that just I can't imagine working in any other.
It's silly, but I just got the chills because it's where I figured out who I was, and it
Yeah,
is where I grew up, and it's where I met my husband, and it gave me opportunities that I never thought that I would have. And I think it's all of our jobs to help make sure that those opportunities continue for others.
absolutely. I mean, as somebody who is I credit everything in my life to higher
Yes.
education, and not just the higher education I received as a student,
Yes.
but what I received as a professional working in higher education.
Like the community. That's how you and I
Yeah,
met. And I just think about the supports that I've had personally and professionally. And I think it's just magical.
it really is. And I'm so grateful to the leaders that I've had that have helped me shape me into the person that I am
Hmm.
today
Hmm.
and given me tools that have made me a better human. It's just a wonderful industry.
I agree.
Pivoting to our topic today, you recently wrote about the difficulty of discussing sensitive topics, like, for an example, the current war in Gaza right now. When you're talking to leaders, how do you advise them to approach those communications challenges?
I think we make this harder than we need to. And I say that because in the end, what we really need to do is to go back to the basics of focusing on students and faculty and staff and alumni and what they need, not what we think we need to tell them.
Mm,
We need to focus on meeting mission, and we also need to focus on doing all of the other work and jobs and responsibilities that we know we have to get done,
mhm,
even if we're in turmoil. And often we just focus on the turmoil and forget to engage with everybody with where they want to be met with us most fundamentally. So
mm,
I think in higher education, too often we think about crises as teachable moments, and they are for us, but they're not necessarily for our audiences. Our stakeholders are interested in having key leadership moments really shine and not feel as if they are in a classroom receiving a lecture. And that's
mm.
a huge pivot for all of us to think about how we approach these. And I think there's this interesting framework that I would love to share with you. And actually, last week, Augustana College President Emeritus Steve Balls, he had an op-ed in Inside Higher Ed where he shared a framework I helped him and his board develop. I'll make sure that that link is available to you to share with your listeners. And I'm proud of the work that he described in that piece because it has stood the test of time. And I encourage people to read it, not just for the communications criteria that he outlines and how he talks about our work, but it felt like a special kind of win for me. And I think you might agree with this. To have a president advocate for approaching stressful situations with compassion and communications in mind, and to know that I was able to help to shape how he views these topics was everything. So I highly encourage people to look at that because he really does talk about that framing around mission, the framing around what people need from us rather than what we want to share, and the reminder to be human.
That sounds really lovely, and I can't help but notice when you talked about him that you said President Emeritus.
Yes,
So that tells me he's not a president right now,
correct.
which does that give him a little bit more of an opportunity to talk about these issues than a sitting president might have?
So he actually talks about that in the piece.
Mm,
And when you see that, I smarted a little bit when I read it. And then since then, I've decided it was a compliment. He talks about the fact that his communications professionals would sometimes uh, in essence silence him or try
Mm,
to, I'm sure he would say, handle him. But instead, my job was to make sure that I was keeping both him and the institution focused where they needed to be focused. And sometimes that means you don't just get to say something,
yeah.
or you need to frame that in a way that it supports your institution and your mission. And so I'm proud to say that when Steve was president, he did not shy away from taking on the tough topics, but he was willing to think about how sometimes it needed to be shaped so that it better met his audience's expectations, not just what he needed to process or he wanted to feel.
Mm.
So I'm always proud of how he addressed tough topics because he didn't shy away from bold language, bold stances, and being a leader.
I have found myself in rooms where it is me and legal
Yes.
advising a president in these situations. And in those cases, sometimes those bold statements get smashed down, for lack of a better word. Like
Hmm.
the legals, like, you can't say that. You can't say that. And I remember getting into kind of a battle over my president using the phrase Black Lives Matter
Hmm.
in a message. And she was absolutely insistent that we would all lose our jobs and the whole place would close if he said those words. And I was really proud of him for insisting that we keep that in the piece and absolutely would not back down from it needing to be in the piece. But do you find communicators and legal are often at odds in some of these conversations?
I think that's a fantastic question. And the reason I say it's fantastic is that I think sometimes leadership gets to set the tone for whether or not we're pitted against each other. And
Mm,
often when I know that legal is going to make their case first, I know that the expectation from many in the room is that we are going to be at odds. So I
mm,
always try to figure out where we have commonality. And honestly, it's usually 98% of the time that we have commonality. It's that 2% that I need to think through and to really assess, and I ask others to assess each of our expertise. Is what they're suggesting their legal advice,
mhm,
or is it a word recommendation? Because if it's
mhm.
their legal advice, then I'll work with them on that. But if they are providing me instead with an edit to what I think sounds most natural and aligned with the institution, then I am going to decline their edit. We both have expertise, and that doesn't mean that one necessarily needs to override the other. It means we need to understand the context that their advice is being presented with.
I love the way you phrase that. And it reminds me of other conversations with this general counsel where I said, is this legal advice? Is
Yes.
what we're doing generating a legal issue for the institution, or is this communications advice? And then was able to then position as I'm the expert for giving communications advice, and she's the one that keeps us out of the court of law and makes sure that communication doesn't get us there. And I think we ended in a place before she retired where she respected that. Um, but it was very difficult for her to let go of that control because she'd been there a very long time and had
Right.
advised many, many presidents.
Well, and I think how you're framing that also reflects the maturity of where marketing and communications are within an institution. So her experience had been that we were there to staff whatever was
Yes.
happening. And the
Mhm.
reality is now we are there to serve as counsel alongside the lawyers. And
Yeah.
that really is, I think it's just so important to reflect on because it shows that we're in such a different place now, as marketers and communicators, and what we bring to the table and also what we are able to help to shape.
That is so true. And I think back to earlier in my career when I started almost 20 years ago now, we weren't in the room
Hmm.
when the decisions were made. We were given something essentially to proof
Yes.
that had been hammered out, but generally speaking, between legal and the president, or the president and the provost, or whatever. And so just being in the room now
Yes.
is such a big step forward. And the fact that there are presidents like this, this president that I'm speaking about, that always had me in the room for those
Yes.
conversations.
I was just talking to a classroom of PR students yesterday about this. I was saying, here's what I want you to have as an expectation. And it was no surprises. And I said, but here's how I want you to think about it. It's not that you don't want to have a situation where you are taking something to your boss for the first time. You might also have to manage up on that. And
Mm,
by that, I mean, no surprises, meaning you don't want to be the last one to come into a room and you're surprised with what the situation is, what you're going to be expected to do, and the timeline you have to do it. So, managing up so that your boss knows you need to be there early, and then
mhm.
also making sure that you have that no surprises so that they trust you to be in that room for those conversations.
I so appreciate that, and that is such exceptional advice for early career because I think when, a lot of people when they're early in their career, I think they are hesitant or they don't have the confidence yet.
Yes.
I was talking to someone on my team today who was making the transition to providing counsel, and she was saying that for her, her boss told her, "No, we don't wait for direction. We provide our counsel, we provide
Yes.
our advice and our recommendation, and that's what you're here for. That's what you're paid for. That's why we have you." And she said it was this moment of, oh, oh, okay. And she needed to actually hear somebody tell her that.
I think that's huge. I know I have a colleague that she had just received a promotion, and I think this aligns with that. And she came to me and she said, my boss came to me and said, where is the strategy? And I said, I don't know. You haven't presented it to me yet. And I
Oh,
told her, I said, okay, well, let's go back a step. You
yeah.
want to bring the strategy because you want to shape the direction and your own future. And you want
Yes.
to be the one that is the person they go to, not the person they have implement.
Mm,
You want to be all of the things. You don't on your own want to start to decrease what you can provide as value.
that is such, if you're listening to this, you need to like rewind 30 seconds and re-listen to this again because that is exceptional, exceptional advice. Um, in a recent piece, you critiqued the media's treatment of college presidents as sort of being akin to participants in a reality show, which
Yeah.
when you made that analogy, I was like, you know what? That is exactly it. And I'm curious about your thoughts around how you think we should manage the public perception and media portrayal of our presidents, particularly at institutions where we end up in the spotlight. I would say, flagship presidents in
Yes.
particular,
Yes.
and those presidents of those really high profile institutions in particular are in that situation.
Agreed. And I think that there's this shift that I've seen over my career, and that's that with social media, how presidents communicate and engage has significantly shifted.
Mm,
So there used to be the opportunity for you to engage with others and to receive feedback in the moment from
mhm,
those that you were communicating with. And now presidents are less willing to be participatory, in part because they may get feedback immediately, but more importantly, they may get feedback after the fact. They may get feedback that seems to feel like it comes from nowhere. And they're not just getting feedback, they're getting backlash from their
mm,
own audiences and from those who really have no connection to the institution. And as a result, I'm seeing more presidents who are limiting how accessible and vulnerable they are to their own internal and external stakeholders. And I think that's really dangerous because the reality is that all leaders need to have some vulnerability, or people conflate the person with the role and they begin to treat them with less humanity. They see them
mm,
as a title and not as a human being. So, my advice to presidents is that they need to build and maintain relationships with audiences, which I know sounds pretty obvious, and it is. But we've
right?
moved away from that, and we're so much more likely to send a broadcast email than we are to actually communicate directly with people. And I know that there's a scale issue here with large campuses, but that doesn't mean that you still can't go for a connection.
Mm,
And it also doesn't mean that you can't build your own feedback loops so that you can start to figure out who and what you should be paying attention to. So Be judicious about the feedback you solicit. Make sure that it is broad and it covers your stakeholders, but the who and the what and the how impacts what's collected and then what you can use for decision making. And I see a lot of presidents who are using advice from those who may not have anything to do with their institution to make really strategic decisions that do impact those who have everything to do with their community.
I like that you mentioned and talked about that sort of disconnect from the audiences. And I think about when I was at Winston-Salem State, Elwood Robinson was receiving a lot of negative feedback for a quote that had been out of context in
Hmm.
the local newspaper. And the students were doing, flyers, and the faculty were all riled up. And he said, Jamie, I'm doing a town hall. And I was
Yes.
terrified. I was like,
Yes.
oh my gosh, okay. Like, how do we prep for this? And he said, I don't need to. And do you know what? He held a town hall. He invited anybody and everybody who wanted to attend from the institution.
Hmm.
And he sat on the edge of the stage. He didn't stand behind a podium. He sat on the edge of the
Yes.
stage and he poured his heart out. He talked about how much he loved the university, loved HBCUs, loved
Oh,
being an HBCU chancellor. And he said, I will stand here. I will be here until you run out of questions. And they started out with very agitated questions, and you could tell the sincerity of his answers and the transparency and vulnerability of his answers. And by the end, it was like, cool. And the situation died. There was no further anything after that. But I feel like today, that was probably almost 8 years ago now. I feel like today you would be so worried about that getting onto social media. You'd be so worried about bad actors
mhm.
being present and having disingenuous questions and disingenuous attacks. I worry about it because it was so effective and it just made the students love him again. They had loved him before, there was this blip, and they loved him again.
In my mind, it's February, so let's go ahead and give a Valentine. In my mind, I saw a heart, and it was accountability plus vulnerability plus transparency equals trust,
Yeah.
right? And it gets back to the point of being a human. It gets back to showing people that you are accountable for your actions and also for your role. And I
Mm.
think playing it safe isn't working in higher education right now.
How do you recommend that leaders sort of navigate if they have some sort of angst on their campus, some sort of public fury about something they've said or done or not said or done? How do you recommend they get through that without losing their focus on the institutional mission and the long term goals of the institution? Because it can be so easy to get dragged into
Yes.
these situations and forget about everything else.
And you'll probably be baited to try to be drug into the conversations.
Yeah.
So I recently noted on Trusted Voices, which is the podcast that I co-host, that sometimes you need to buy a really good set of noise canceling headphones to do your job.
Mm,
And I'm encouraging my presidents to commit to the emotional equivalent. Because if presidents are truly, truly prioritizing what's in the best interest of the institution and in the best interest of their students, then they can learn from their critique that truly applies, and then they can let the rest of it just roll off of their backs. But right
mm.
now, a lot of presidents are taking what truly applies to make them stronger in their roles and also a whole bunch of noise, and they're trying to make sense of it. So, this is why I think it's really important for presidents to have really good data from social listening and from internal feedback. Both of those can help presidents to differentiate between that feedback from their constituents that matters and the vitriol that's being lobbed at them, sometimes for sport, sometimes for attention, and sometimes for political gain. But that usually comes from outside of the institution. So, think about what you need to be able to make decisions and do your job, and then put those noise canceling headphones on.
Being a college president has to be one of the loneliest and most difficult jobs. In the light of what you just said and staying focused on mission, I imagine that for presidents are human beings, right? They have all the same ability to be hurt and have mental health challenges and have that infect their physical selves. How do you counsel presidents who are just like, I'm overwhelmed, Teresa. I don't know how to manage my own emotions through this situation?
There's a couple of things that I encourage. One is look at your team. Quite often, the cabinet is asking how they can help. And a lot of presidents feel as if they have to do it all themselves. So look to your team, look to why you have hired them to have these roles, and start to delegate some of what you're holding because you think you should.
Mm,
Hold what you have to and what is presidential and start to delegate what you can delegate. That's one. The second is I think that there has to be reflection from presidents of when they're starting to hit a limit. I
mm,
have a president that I encouraged to buy a Garmin watch. And she isn't a runner. And I told her, that's fine. I don't want you to have it for the running capabilities, although exercise helps too. I'm not going to lie. But
right.
what I told her is it has this feature that I use, and it's a body battery count. And so, what it will tell you is it looks at all of the different stressors in your life. It's looking at your blood pressure, and it's looking at the exercise that you get and the sleep and the quality of the sleep. It's looking at a number of different data points for you, and it will tell you on a scale of 1 to 100 how charged your body battery is. And what I told her was what I was seeing is that her body battery had to be below 10 because she was
Wow.
running herself too hard. And I needed for her to have some way to actually measure that and then to do something about it. Because the Garmin isn't going to tell you what to do about it. It tells you you need to do something about it. And that can be finding a hobby, it can be going for a walk, it can be a number of different ways that you just give yourself a place for peace. And I don't
Mm,
know that we prioritize that enough for our presidents because we want them to be on at all times and they think they need to be present for everything. And it's really hard to stay present in the moment if that moment has now been going on for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years.
yeah.
We need to give ourselves grace as much as we try to provide it to others.
It's interesting that you mentioned this battery piece. I was recently talking with the president. She was talking about the difficulty of the job and how the boards and the student body and the alumni really truly expect you to do literally everything. Every sporting event,
Yes.
every concert, every play, every dinner, every breakfast, everything. And she was saying that for her, she started off by setting a boundary with her
Hmm.
board and saying, before she was even hired, I need to have at least one weekend a month where I just sit in my jammies
Yes.
and spend time with my family and play games with my kids and just be a human being. And I just thought that was such an interesting thing that she felt that she needed to set that boundary up front. And I'm not really surprised, given what we expect of our presidents, that she had to do that up front.
Yes.
And she was like, I will tell you if I'm not getting this, I will tell you, no, I'm serious about this. I know myself.
Yes. And I think putting in place systems so that you don't have to be everywhere all of the time. One of my first responsibilities out of college, I reported directly to a president, is I was in charge of his correspondence. Do you remember those days? But I
Yes.
still think about that because written notes matter. So anything
Yes.
that he had to decline got a personal note and he would handwrite them all and then I would type them up and we would make sure that they got signed and sent. And 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 I also had a secondary list, which was everything that he didn't even realize that we had already screened for him. And
Mm,
I wrote the notes for those, and he signed those, and we sent those out as well. So that for those that he had a personal relationship and connection, they got him personally. And for those
mm,
that didn't, but wanted so much to have the president see what they were doing and to celebrate with them in what they were learning, they got a recognition for that too. And it's funny because I had one of my good friends from college very recently send me a picture in a text. And it was a picture of a letter that I knew, and they knew, that I had written from that president. And they said they still have it to this day because they felt seen. So there are
oh,
ways for us to think about what does that mean and what does that look like in today's world.
I absolutely love that perspective because I do think you get this pressure of I'm letting somebody down.
Yes.
And when we all feel that, right? And it's so presidents are new to everything that we feel as leaders, as human beings, they're feeling and often at a magnitude. And from that perspective, what advice do you have for those of us who support presidents to be better supporters for them?
I think it really is getting to know who that person is. We all have tells, all of us do. And it's
Hmm.
to start to understand what that tell is. So, for the presidents that I work for, my goal is to better understand their tell when they're tired, when they are frustrated, when they are at their best, when they're happy, all of
Mm,
the different emotions, so that I can try to move them towards the positive experiences and encounters. Because if I can see their tells, others can too. And so, how do we start to put into place what some of these other opportunities might be for us to step in, even if they didn't know that they needed our support?
mm.
I am having this really interesting conversation this week with the chief of staff. And she reached out to me and she said, I think my president's bored, not with the
Huh.
job, but he's used to being engaged. And now everybody wants him to solve something, but we aren't providing him with opportunities to learn something.
Huh.
So
Interesting.
she and I are going to work on a curriculum, if you will, and he knows this, so that we're engaging him and he's thinking and learning, and he has a place to just banter about topics that he enjoys. And I think that that's really important to be learning and to be learning about something that you really want to learn about, because quite often we get trapped in what we should be learning and not what brings us joy. So, how can we
Mm.
find those opportunities to also share what we know is going to make them light up? Because if they light up because they're engaged in new ways, they're going to light up as they go into that next meeting too.
I'm literally almost in tears right now, Teresa, because I'm thinking about almost every morning. This is hard for me to say. I'm like feeling very choked up. Almost every morning when I worked at Winston-Salem State, Elwood would come in and strike up a conversation about something he saw in the news, something he read, something he did, and he would just be so animated and excited to talk about whatever that topic is. And I remember thinking like this is kind of weird, but okay, like I enjoyed it. I loved talking to him. But when you say that, it's like I didn't realize that that was probably like a service to him. It
Yes.
was like
Yes.
I get to just talk about something I wanna talk about.
Something
And
that caught my eye, not something
yeah,
that everybody else wants for me to fix or to mitigate or to whatever it might be, right? Instead, it's this is what caught my eye, and I want to share it with you.
yeah. I'm honestly, like, choked up a little bit
That
to think
also tells
about.
me how close you both were.
Yeah, I miss him. I really
Oh,
miss him. I know he listens to the podcast, and I'm gonna have him on. We keep trying to find a date, but, he's wonderful. He's truly wonderful. So when you think about this, like, very stressful job
hmm
that presidents have, like, there's been numerous articles out there about it being one of the most stressful jobs in the country right now, and I feel like, and this is me kind of going out on a limb, that there's a playbook that has been written to distract higher education leaders and
yes.
distract us from our mission. And what advice do you give for leaders on continuing to communicate the mission? Not just be dedicated to it, but continually communicate that mission. And are there things presidents can do to sort of defeat that playbook that's trying to distract them from that mission?
I love the way you framed that, and I think as marketing and communications professionals, people think that we just work in marketing and communications, but I like to say that I work at the intersection of leadership and communications, and I don't know that the two of those can be separated. And for that reason, I think that communications planning and the ways in which we work with our presidents has to be tailored to that president, and that presidents then need to frame their vision for the institution within the institution's mission. So,
Mm,
how do we think about that? And then once they think about what that means, then we can talk about how to communicate it. But there's a snapshot for kind of how I think about this. And I think that presidential communications needs to articulate the president's vision, which is the what, and their leadership approach. That has to be foundational to how we frame this. And that's the how. And then I encourage them to position the institution's mission as the why. So if we're
Mm,
thinking along those terms, um, sometimes we make this so much harder than it needs to be. But if we're just having them think about the what, the how, and the why, that's a lot easier. And missions are aspirational and they should be inspirational. And they almost always, if not always, center on students and education and research and service, the core responsibilities that we have. And that's what I think really starts to excite presidents and focus them back, is that we're having them focus and shift away from distractions and instead to why they're doing what they're doing. It
mm.
is about the students. It is about the education. It's about the research and the service. And I know so often when we read those mission statements, sometimes they look a little stale or dry or dusty, but dive into it and go back. My first president that I worked for, he had me go back and read speeches from presidents throughout the years at my alma mater and to hear how they talked about their passion for the institution. And his
Mm,
challenge for me always was help me find the words to express that kind of emotion and respect and love for the institution as well. And
mm.
that I think is really so core to the mission of higher education.
Hey, it's Jamie Hunt, and I want to personally invite you to the industry's hottest event this summer, the Engage Summit, hosted in Raleigh on June 25th and 26th. The Engage Summit is your roadmap for AI readiness in higher education. Sessions will focus on cutting edge AI applications that are reshaping student outreach, enhancing staff productivity, and offering deep insights into ROI. This isn't your typical conference. It's a strategic summit where you'll learn from the best about leveraging AI and digital strategies in higher ed marketing. Imagine 2 days filled with hands on sessions, real success stories, and the chance to network with top minds in the field. You'll leave with practical, transformative takeaways as you learn how AI fosters a more personalized, efficient approach, from recruitment to student success. Oh, and the best part? The Engage Summit is incredibly affordable. Use the discount code Enrollify50 and you can register for just $99. So join your favorite Enrollify network creators at the Engage Summit this June. Learn more and register at engage.element451.com. We can't wait to see you there. I absolutely love that. And I love that the president wanted to be part of that thread
Yes,
of history
yes.
and saw himself as not the ego that's in the position. It's he's in this sort of sacred
His
role that
caretaker
has,
role, yeah.
yeah, 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 I love
It's
that.
a I think the respect for where the institution has been is so key.
Mm,
And quite often we focus our presidents only on them
mm,
and where they want to go. But to
mm-hmm,
have that reflection of how you got to that point and the respect that you have for all of your alumni, that's really what you're talking about, right? And who has come before you and why the institution exists. That's really where you start to get, even the most curmudgeonly of presidents to tear up a little bit.
yeah. Well, you have to think about the thread that has
Yes.
carried your institution through time. And I know at the start of the pandemic, a lot of us wrote about we've survived wars, we've
Hmm.
survived um, grave threats, the depression, we've survived all kinds of things. And we'll survive this too. And I think if you think about that and paint your institution in the light of everything you've made it through so far,
Hmm.
you can then paint a picture of a future that is stable and steady and continuing the mission.
And I think that future, as you just described it, is our collective future. Because I think
Mm,
that's where we also start to have some uh, turmoil, some disjuncture, some anger, right? Is when people see themselves or feel themselves shaking out of being part of that collective movement forward.
mm,
So, how do we start to think about community? How do we make sure that we are extending um, and inviting others to be part of our community, and what does it look like when we move forward together? I think
Mm.
that's critically important because sometimes we don't stop to make sure that everybody is there with us. Instead, we wonder why they aren't.
Mm. And maybe we've never invited
Remember,
them to
maybe
be.
we haven't invited them. Maybe we didn't notice when they stopped to tie their shoe and we just kept going, right? All of these
Yeah.
different ways in which we either moved on without them or they moved on uh, without us. But if we
Yeah.
want to have a higher education community that supports each other, like we like to think we always have, then we need to be offering those supports.
For communicators in these roles, and particularly for those of us who are vice presidents
Hmm.
or chief communications officers, depending on how your institution has positioned you, what do you think we need to keep in mind to really help our presidents in these situations? And really, not just in these situations, but to help them just with the difficulty of the jobs that they have.
I think that my marketing and communications colleagues have so much data and information that really can be useful to presidents. So many of them are academics, and so they are still thinking with a data mindset, and
Hmm.
helping them to bridge what they are experiencing in that role versus how others are experiencing the institution, helping them to understand what your market research says and your social listening tells you, and the qualitative and quantitative feedback that people are getting across the campus. What that looks like and feels like is so critically important. But often we don't want to share unless we're asked because we don't know if it's going to be wanted. And when
Mm,
we do share, sometimes we get so excited that we're asked that we share a lot and in ways that aren't as digestible for our presidents. So think through what it is that they need to be successful. I have some presidents that I need to make a case for. Most of those are come from law backgrounds, right? And I need to make a
yep.
case for them. And how do I infuse data into how I do that? Others need a bulleted list. Others need to see the data for themselves. Others want a 1 or 2 page memo. Think about what it is that they need to be successful. And then once you meet them there and you start to build that relationship and that interest in what you do, what you can share, and what you can provide, then you can go into all of the details about what you know and what else you can do to be of assistance. But meet them where they want to be met first, engage them there, and then they will be more receptive to engaging in how you want to be engaged as well. But a lot of presidents don't have a lot of time, so think about what that looks like. I have one back when I was on a campus that I would say, I know the only time that you have to process is they used to walk around campus. And really, they would walk around campus, they'd be visible and to see people, but also it gave them time to process. So we used to book some of our meetings so that I could walk with them.
Mm,
And that was really important. Sometimes I never said a word, and other times I was a sounding board, and other times I could present what I thought would make them more successful. So
mm.
find those places where they want to be met and you can meet them.
I think being able to read where they are in a moment as
Yes,
well is really helpful. If you come in and they are harried and busy and heading to their next thing or clearly very stressed about something or something else is on their mind, that might not be the best time to present them with a case for something.
agreed.
Um, and kind of finding those moments when you think they might be most receptive. And you mentioned, the lawyers turned college presidents, and I'm thinking that it might be beneficial to understand their discipline and the discipline that
Yes,
they came from. Like the English professor that turned president will
yes,
probably have a very different communication style and desire for information than maybe a STEM engineering
100% agreed.
chemist, that kind of thing.
Yes. And I think it also can be reflected in some ways. It's like ghostwriting, right? You were
Hmm.
writing to an audience of one. You were writing how they would write if they were thinking about this topic. So, again, I have some presidents who very much like prose. And I know that
Hmm.
I need to make sure that it is proofed by everybody because the grammar needs to be spot on. And they want to engage in a story, but a story that has data. I have some of my scientists that just want the facts. And then they
Hmm.
want to know my recommendation, and finding exactly how they process is key. Here's what I like to do, and It's so nerdy. And again, remember, I come from a policy background. I pull up their academic works and I look
Mm,
to see how they made their arguments when they were trying to convince others of their positions. And I try as best I can to mirror that.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
That is
And then you
genius.
also learn something really cool about them. They cared enough
Right.
to write these things. And if you can,
Right.
show them that you care a little bit about maybe, Russian history or, whatever it might be, that means a lot to them too.
I love that. There's so many pearls of wisdom in this episode. I'm so glad you're
Well,
here.
thank you.
So, when you look ahead, what do you see as some of the big, major potential communications challenges
Oh.
that presidents are going to face, and how should we be preparing for them?
I think the first piece of advice I would give is that history usually helps us to understand today. So,
Mm,
just a reminder that it's 2024 and this is an election year. So,
yes.
I think that there are a lot of topics many people use against higher education because they are testing how those are going to work with their base.
Mm,
So, as we think about what we have ahead of us, remember that sometimes we are the canary in the coal mine. And unfortunately, we don't realize it until we can't breathe.
mm,
And we become then, let me add another metaphor, we become the bellwether, right, for what's going on in the greater ecosystem in this country. And I think we really have started to be the testing ground. So know that that's the case and look to see what some of those themes are from across the country and what that could mean for your institution. So, what is being discussed politically? What is being discussed on other campuses? And how would you react to that? I think is key. And I would say this continued question of our value is something that I don't see letting up. And we need to find new and different ways to talk about what we provide and why we're important. I don't think we're getting there yet. And I think there are a number of people who are getting closer. I think we're starting to think about not just what is our value, but really why are or aren't we trusted? And
mm,
how do people think about what we provide or where we fall short? And I think we need to be thinking about this differently, that it's not necessarily about ROI, because to me, that feels more like an equation. And we're
hmm
talking about people and how they engage or don't engage with us. So, how do we, again, going all the way back to the beginning of our discussion, make this more human?
mm. I would love to see a lot more proactivity in
Yes.
this space.
Yes.
I'm in the Fellowship for Innovative Higher Education Leadership this year, and we met last week, and a topic of discussion was around what can we do more as a coalition? How
Yes.
can we partner together? Because again, I think there's a national playbook against us right
I
now.
agree.
And why is there not a national playbook in favor of us? And how do we get that? And how do we work together across institutions to talk about the value, to try to defeat some of these attacks against us? Um, and why do you think that holds us back from that?
I think in part it's because we spend so much time, and this applies to marketing and communications as well, thinking about how do we differentiate our institution. We stop contributing as if we are a part of something bigger, of a system.
Mm,
So that competition makes us think about this is where we are different, this is where we are better, this is where we compete, this is where we have vulnerabilities, whatever it might be. It's not, this is as an industry the value that we provide, right? It's
mm,
not a one upsmanship, but it's instead a collaboration. And I think that we do that when we're together. So I have the great fortune of going to a number of conferences that presidents attend, and I'll be at one next week. And you get to see the presidents together, and they're on the same page. And I think what happens is they go back to their campus, and it's too easy to fall into whatever dragons you're slaying that day and how you need to bring in that class. So you need to differentiate your institution. And they so quickly forget what collectively we can do together.
mm. That is so true. That is so true. Because you think about um, the pressure on enrollment right now because of the enrollment cliff.
Yes,
Probably most campuses, that is the bulk of the energy from September to May,
yes,
basically, and then we all sort of collapse and hope that melts and yield and focus on all of that. There's not really a time to focus on something else unless we deliberately carve out that time.
And it's getting harder, not easier. Looking at the FAFSA data sharing, that's not going to come until March, which means packaging for many institutions will really have to kickstart then. What does that mean for, the decision date of May 1st? Are we still going to have May 1st in the same way this year? And so some of those pressures, as you said, you could then collapse as of May. Maybe that's not what we're going to have this year. And that additional pressure and stress, I would encourage presidents to be thinking about that now. How can they both support their teams as they deal with this stress and also be managing expectations for the board, for the community, both on and off campus, for so many different stakeholders that are used to a cycle and a rhythm of communications that we might not have this year, and we might have to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Mm, that's so wise. That's so wise. I want to make a pretty big pivot here. So we've been talking about how to support our presidents, how to support our institutions from a presidential perspective, but sometimes there are crises that involve the behaviors of our president. And I am thinking specifically right now of Bonnie Candia Bailey and the situation that happened at Lincoln University in Missouri. It just feels like a crisis that the institution is going to have to reckon with, regardless of what comes out of the investigation into that president. How would you counsel their board for moving forward from this?
Oh, it is such a tough situation, and my heart is so broken for that campus and for her family and for, just it's hard, right? And I think that this is about so much more than communications, and it's really at the crux of leadership. So for that board, if I were advising them, they need to encourage the space and the time to grieve and to reflect as a start. But that's only the start. Because I also think they need a very honest review. I know they're having a review done, but truly for them to think about and review, not just have a review performed of the leadership and climate and the culture of their campus. And they need the fortitude to implement true change. And what I would also say is that I think that this is also a perfect moment for other boards to stop and to think about what the climate and the culture are on their campuses as well. Because I hope that we don't have this kind of a situation elsewhere, but I also know, visiting as many campuses as I do, that I think that there are more boards that should also be paying attention to how people are treated, the respect that is given or maybe isn't, the ways in which people are allowed to experience mental health crises, and also just the need to develop healthy environments. So, as much as we talk about building these healthy environments for our students, I think we need to be thinking across all of our institution, is this a healthy place for people, and are we encouraging them to thrive? And I don't know that we give that same kind of reflection beyond our students, sometimes our faculty. I don't think we're thinking as much about our staff. I don't think we're thinking about our administrators. And we're not thinking about what our hierarchies may be creating.
Mm, that is so profound. And I think part of what hits people, I think, really hard about this is because we've seen a dismaying number of women of color
Yes,
in leadership roles who have either died in on the
yes,
job, died as a result of the stress of the job, which I think that Dr. Candia Bailey falls into that.
yes,
And the number of Black women in particular on LinkedIn that I'm connected with
yes,
who have said, this is not an unusual way to be treated.
I agree. Not that I'm agreeing with that. I'm agreeing that this
Yeah.
reflects what I'm seeing within my networks and my community and my people, right? As I think about those that we're close with, and I think in some ways that goes back to body battery. There we go. And the reason that I say that is because I think in some ways we need to also be performing those body battery responsibilities with each other as well. So
Mhm.
that if we see someone that we're worried about where they might be on that scale of 1 to 100, that we're reaching out. And you and I are in a network, in a community where I feel like we do that. And we
Mhm.
may not always be around each other, but we can sense when maybe somebody needs just a text or an invite for a call, or may need something more than that. What are ways that we would want to be treated, and who are the people that we know well enough to start to help if we see that they're struggling in ways that we can help with. And part of that also, and this is what makes me stay up at night, is I worry about those that don't have the same connections and community and relationships, and so there isn't that person to see them when they
Mhm.
need an intervention, or they need a hug, or they need a cup of coffee, or whatever it might be. So maybe this is a moment for all of us to think about opening up our communities and our networks just a little bit wider for others.
Mm. I love that. I worry so deeply, particularly for the women of color who are struggling,
Hmm.
because there's still such a stigma around mental health,
Yes.
and there's such a stigma around taking a break, taking time to take care of yourself, around self care, around
Yes.
being anything other than like the badass, strong, kick ass woman that, fought her way to the role that she's in. And all of that emotional weight and that toll that all takes on you. And in that, having the ability to say, I need help is just almost impossible, I
Yes.
feel. And I feel like what you just said about it's not on the person who's struggling
Mm.
to necessarily look for help, but it's on all of us who work in higher education to offer the help and to look out for each other and to see those signs. And you're right, it can be hard. Sometimes you're on a Zoom call with somebody and they
Yes.
just seem off. Or I saw somebody yesterday and I said, I think she was crying, and I went after,
Hmm.
kind of went and followed after and asked if everything was okay, and it was. I had misread the vibes, but I'd rather misread the vibe
Agreed.
than let somebody feel totally alone. Because honestly, I think death by suicide is when somebody feels totally alone.
And I also think that there is this reality that as we're talking about presidents, as we're talking about Marcom professionals, we have these very visible positions. And so sometimes people don't want to show, going all the way back to the beginning, their humanity and their vulnerabilities. And that can be so harmful,
Mhm.
to our cultures and also to the individuals. And I applaud Raynard Kington, who recently had a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, who talked about when he was president, he had panic attacks and what that looked like.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about that enough, that it is okay to need to focus on your own mental health, even in these very important positions, and how to think about as a leader talking to your staff and to your bosses, right, to your board, about how to set up structures so that you can be in a safe place for you and you can be successful. And I thought that piece was so vulnerable, and I applaud him for talking about that. And I hope that others read that and see that he's kick ass. And
Mhm.
for him to admit what he has gone through so that others can understand that they're not alone is just so extremely powerful.
I absolutely was moved by that piece, and I thought it took courage, and that's sad
Hmm.
that reality and that level of vulnerability took courage to express, and I wish that it didn't. And I feel like Gen Z is gonna get this on the right path, right? Like, I feel
Yes.
like they're much more willing to talk about their mental health challenges, their physical health challenges, and whatever they're facing. But I remember reading that piece and thinking, like, okay, if he's struggling, that
Yeah,
means it's okay that I sometimes struggle.
right. And I think you're right that Gen Z, when they talk about themselves, they talk about themselves in totality. So it's
Mhm.
not just how others want to see them. They'll lead
Mhm.
with how they want you to understand them so fundamentally. And the freedom and the strength and just the courage to do that, I hope that we can all learn from that, because
Mhm.
I've heard some people who say they're oversharing, and I tell them I think they are perfectly sharing, and there's something for all of us to learn from that.
Absolutely. I had a student trustee on one of the at one of the campuses I served who shared in a public meeting his own personal struggles with mental health issues. And he told me afterwards that a trustee pulled him aside and said, leaders don't do that.
Oh,
Leaders don't talk about their challenges. And it broke my heart.
if we want to give an environment in which people can talk about their successes, then we need to go ahead and meet them to talk about how they got to those successes. And the
Hmm.
reality is that every single one of us has had struggles, and every single one of us has been challenged, but we don't talk about those parts. We only talk about where we ended up. And that makes it really, really hard for those who are coming up next to think that they have to go from where they are immediately to success. I think we are doing a disservice to our colleagues not to express and share how we got to where we are, because it's not perfect. We aren't
Mm-mm,
perfect. And that's
mm-mm.
a reality that needs to be nurtured and needs to be encouraged.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If anybody's listening and thinks that you have to have it all
Mm.
together, and I'm putting that kind of in air quotes,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you have to be this sort of mythical, almost machine-like person
Yes.
who can just be and do everything without struggle. There is not one human being in leadership that is true for. There is not one.
Yes.
You can do it. You can do it with your struggles and your challenges. You can do this. You can do this. You don't have to be this mythological being.
So we're getting to a point that I think is very close to who we both are. I think that we both are, I like to say I'm a realistic optimist, but the optimist comes first. And
Mm,
I think the two of us are people focused, and we are connectors, and we also take so seriously the responsibility to allow others to have opportunities like we do. And
mhm.
the absolute bedrock of that is higher education.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tressa, I so value your friendship.
Same. Thank you.
I'm very emotional with this conversation, to be honest with listeners, because I just think it's such an important one to have. Do you have any final thoughts or reflections that you'd like to share?
I think where we just were, I hope serves as a starting point for others as we talk about the need for vulnerability. We both went there and are encouraging that of others. So, what I would say is, I think you talked about this so beautifully to say we didn't just get here. And sometimes I think about, accolades that I've received, and that isn't what my career has entirely focused on. And if anybody ever wants to hear what I've done right and wrong, I'm happy to talk about that and have others hopefully bypass some of my missteps. But I've learned from each of those too. So I was talking to someone recently, and they were saying that they were telling me I was courageous for having gray hair and wrinkles. And I said, I'm not. I'm reflecting that life is a journey, and I have had a hell of a journey. So don't be afraid to have that gray hair and those wrinkles, because it helps you get to the place where you can help others as they go through the different steps in their careers too.
I absolutely love that. I love that. It's such a great closing thought. And I think something that you mentioned, when I say you're not going to have this linear magical
Yes.
path to success, right? And the success is not a destination either. Success is a mindset, right? You can choose to be happy where you are. You can choose to be satisfied with where the heights that you have achieved. But I think one of the things that you mentioned that I think is critical, the thing that sets people apart, the thing that makes you able to move in leadership is learning from failure and being willing to learn from failure, because you will fail. You may fail more than you succeed.
Yes.
But as long as you're committed to learning from that failure, you will continue to move forward.
And it's when I fail that I realize the strength of my community. So thank you for being part of my community.
And likewise, where can people find you? Because everybody wants to talk to Teresa. Where can people find you?
These days, the easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn. So Teresa Valerio Parrot, all three. I'm also on Threads, still all three, Teresa Valerio Parrot. You also are welcome to email me, Teresa, Teresa, at tvpcommunications.com. And I'm always open to meeting new people and to expanding those that are part of my network.
Well, I hope that people do reach out. Teresa is so generous. Listeners, as always, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. You can find me on LinkedIn at Jaime Hunt, Jaime. I'm still like every once in a while on X, Jaime Hunt IMC, Jaime HUNT IMC. I am a little bit on TikTok at the Higher Ed CMO. And please do feel free to reach out. I'm having two conversations this week with people who are struggling with some challenges, and I'm happy to lend help wherever I can. So please feel free to reach out. It might take me a few days to get back to you because calendars get full, but I respond to everyone. And in the meantime, let's go bust some silos. Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO is part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea and feature a selection of the industry best as your host. Learn from Mallory Wilsey, Seth Odell, Jenny Lee Fowler, Eddie Francis, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.